There is an island in Lake Huron that banned the automobile in 1898 and never lifted the ban. Its Grand Hotel still has the longest porch in the world. Horse-drawn carriages still carry tourists down streets that smell like fudge and lilac. And every single thing that once made this island powerful, the fur empire, the military fort, the national park status, the fishing industry, the year-round community, and the family that guarded its most famous landmark for nearly 90 years, gone. Mackinac Island looks precisely the way it did in 1890. That is the most deceptive thing about it. The trick of Mackinac Island is that nothing appears to have changed. The buildings stand, the porch gleams, the horses clip along. 1 million visitors arrive each summer, buy their fudge, snap their photographs, and leave believing they have visited a place that time forgot. But time didn't forget Mackinac Island. It stripped the place clean, layer by layer, industry by industry, institution by institution, and left the shell so perfectly intact that almost nobody noticed what was missing. To understand how that happened, start with what the island used to be, because it was never supposed to be a postcard. The Anishinaabe people, the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi, considered Mackinac Island sacred ground. They called it Michilimackinac, the Great Turtle, for the shape of its limestone bluffs rising from the water. It was a burial site, a ceremonial gathering place, and a hub for birch bark canoe routes that connected the entire Great Lakes. Long before any European laid eyes on it, this tiny island, barely 4 square miles, sat at one of the most strategically valuable crossroads in North America, the narrow strait where Lake Huron meets Lake Michigan. Whoever controlled that strait controlled everything moving through the upper Great Lakes. Furs, food, people, armies, information, all of it had to pass through this choke point. The island wasn't beautiful. It was powerful. The French understood this first. By the early 1700s, they had established missions and trading posts in the straits, and Mackinac had become the primary transportation corridor in the upper lakes. The British understood it next. After taking control in 1763, they looked at the old wooden French fort on the mainland and decided it was indefensible. In 1780, during the American Revolution, Lieutenant Governor Patrick Sinclair ordered the construction of a new fort, this one made of limestone, on the 150-foot bluffs of Mackinac Island itself. Fort Mackinac would overlook the straits from a height that made it nearly impossible to assault. It was a military masterpiece, and it would stand at the center of conflict, commerce, and ambition for the next century. What happened next is one of the stranger footnotes of the War of 1812, and it tells you everything about why the island mattered. The Americans held the fort when war broke out in June of 1812, but the garrison commander, Lieutenant Porter Hanks, had no idea that war had been declared. Communication moved at the speed of a canoe. 1,200 miles away, British General Isaac Brock sent contradictory orders to Captain Charles Roberts at Fort St. Joseph, first to attack, then to defend, then to use his own judgment. Roberts decided to attack. He gathered a force of about 50 British soldiers, 150 Canadian fur traders and voyageurs, and more than 300 Ojibwe, Odawa, Sioux, Menominee, and Winnebago warriors. They crossed to the island under cover of darkness on the night of July 16, 1812, landed on the northwest shore at a spot now called British Landing, and hauled a cannon through the woods to the high ground above the fort. When the sun rose on July 17th, Lieutenant Hanks found himself looking up at an army that had materialized above him while he slept. The British had taken advantage of the same topography that was supposed to make the fort impregnable. They'd simply climbed higher. Hanks had about 60 soldiers under his command and a civilian population he didn't want caught in a bombardment. He surrendered without a shot being fired. It was the first land engagement of the entire war, and the Americans lost it before they even knew they were fighting. In an almost farcical postscript, the British then hoisted the American flag over the captured fort, and when unsuspecting American supply ships sailed in and tied up at the pier, the British captured those too. The British held the island for the rest of the war. The Americans tried to take it back in 1814, landing troops on the North Shore and marching toward the fort. They were ambushed in a field near Dousman's farm, lost 13 men dead, including Major Andrew Holmes, and were driven back to their ships. When the Treaty of Ghent ended the war, the island was returned to American hands. But the damage was done. The British had proven that whoever held Mackinac Island held the upper Great Lakes. And the man who profited most from that reality was already building his empire. John Jacob Astor was a German immigrant who came to New York and figured out, faster than anyone else, that the money in the Great Lakes wasn't in land or lumber, it was in fur. In 1808, he founded the American Fur Company, and he chose Mackinac Island as its western headquarters. The logic was straightforward. The island sat at the junction of every major trade route. Furs trapped across the Great Lakes region and deep into the Mississippi watershed were packed into canoes, paddled to Mackinac, sorted in warehouses on Market Street, and shipped east to New York and then on to European markets. At its peak, the company moved pelts valued at $3 to $4 million a year, a staggering sum in the 1820s. The operation was enormous. According to Gurdon Saltonstall Hubbard, a clerk who arrived on the island on July 4, 1818, the American Fur Company employed around 400 clerks and some 2,000 trappers and voyageurs when all were assembled. 100 clerks slept in the agency house, 500 others packed into barracks. The rest stayed in islanders' homes or camped in tents along the shore. In the summer months, Mackinac Island's population could swell from a few hundred year-round residents to 4,000. 4 languages bounced off the limestone walls of Market Street: French, English, Ojibwe, and Odawa, sometimes all in the same negotiation. The air smelled like dried pelts and wood smoke and lake water. Bateaus, flat-bottomed boats piled with bales of beaver and muskrat, arrived from rivers that drained half the continent, and hard-drinking voyageurs who'd spent months in the wilderness poured ashore looking for a summer of what Hubbard delicately called ease and rowdy merriment. It was loud, crowded, commercially ruthless, and absolutely central to the American economy. Astor himself never lived on the island. He ran everything from New York, the way a modern CEO might run a company from a corner office while the work happened on factory floors 1,000 miles away. But his agents on Mackinac coordinated contracts, fixed prices, tracked shipments, and managed relationships stretching hundreds of miles inland. Inside the headquarters on Market Street, built in 1817, still standing today, clerks kept detailed ledgers listing pelts by type and quantity. Decisions made in those rooms determined the livelihoods of indigenous trappers, French-Canadian paddlers, and frontier merchants across the entire Great Lakes basin. By 1830, the American Fur Company held what amounted to a monopoly on furs from the United States. Mackinac Island was, in effect, the Wall Street of the wilderness economy. One of the most remarkable among them wasn't a clerk or a military officer. It was a Métis woman named Magdalene Laframboise. Born around 1780 to an Odawa mother and French-Canadian father, Laframboise built a fur-trading operation across western Michigan so successful that Astor's company eventually chose to merge with her rather than keep competing against her. She spoke 4 languages. Her former home still stands on Mackinac Island, operating today as the Harbor View Inn. But Astor always knew the fur trade had an expiration date. Animals were being trapped faster than they could replenish, and fashions were changing. By the early 1830s, European hat makers had begun using silk instead of beaver felt. In 1832, Astor noted from Paris that they were making hats of silk in place of beaver. 2 years later, he sold his interest in the company and retired. The headquarters moved off the island. Within a few years, the American Fur Company was functionally dead. And just like that, Mackinac Island's first economy, the one that had made it matter to empires, evaporated. The warehouses on Market Street went quiet. The voyageurs stopped coming. The clerks left. The island population dropped. A brief fishing industry rose up to fill the gap, but it never matched the scale or the wealth of the fur trade. And that's when something peculiar happened. Something that would define the island for the next century and a half, for better and for worse. The federal government decided to preserve it. On March 3, 1875, President Ulysses S. Grant signed a bill creating Mackinac National Park, the second national park in the United States, 3 years after Yellowstone. Only 3 years. Before Yosemite, before the Grand Canyon, before the Smokies and the Everglades, there was Mackinac. Senator Thomas W. Ferry, who was born on the island, had championed the effort, and the enabling legislation was virtually identical to the language used to create Yellowstone. More than 1,000 acres, over half the island, were set aside for the enjoyment of the public. There was no National Park Service yet, so the Army ran it. Soldiers from Fort Mackinac doubled as park rangers, building roads, maintaining trails, leasing small plots of land to offset expenses because Congress, characteristically, provided no money for the park's upkeep. Visitors came for the fresh air. Mackinac was actually marketed as a healthy retreat for hay fever sufferers, and for the limestone rock formations like Arch Rock and Sugarloaf, geological curiosities that looked like nature had sculpted them as tourist attractions. They came for the romantic notion of a frontier that was already disappearing, and they came because the new national park designation gave the island something it desperately needed after the fur trade collapsed: a reason to exist. This was the moment. This was when Mackinac Island stopped being a place where things happened and started becoming a place where things were remembered. The fur trade was gone. The military importance was fading. The fishing industry was modest. What the island had left was its setting, its architecture, and its story. And so the economy pivoted to selling the experience of being there. The railroads and steamship companies saw the opportunity first. In 1886, the Michigan Central Railroad, the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad, and the Detroit and Cleveland Steamship Navigation Company formed the Mackinac Island Hotel Company. Their plan? Build a luxury summer hotel on the island and use it to sell tickets on their own trains and boats. Senator Francis B. Stockbridge bought the site. The architects were Mason and Rice of Detroit. The builder was Charles W. Caskey, who paid his workers double wages to keep the project moving and used lanterns at night when darkness fell. Construction began in March of 1887. Caskey paid double wages to attract workers and keep them moving. When darkness fell, the crews kept going by candlelight and lantern. At one point, workers demanded triple pay. Caskey refused. The double rate held, the work continued, and on July 10, 1887, 93 days after the first nail was driven, the Grand Hotel opened its doors. It was built of Michigan white pine. The rates were $3 to $5 a night, roughly $100 to $175 in today's money. Its front porch stretched 660 feet, the longest in the world, and it immediately became the place to see and be seen on the Great Lakes. Think about the audacity of the project. 3 competing transportation companies pooling their money to build a luxury hotel on an island you could only reach by boat in a part of Michigan where winter lasted 6 months, and getting the entire thing finished in less than 100 days. Guests arrived by steamship from Chicago, Detroit, Montreal, and Erie. They didn't come for a weekend. They came for weeks, sometimes the entire summer, and they brought their entire social entourages with them. Servants, friends, relatives, wardrobes packed in steamer trunks. Up on the bluffs above the hotel, the cottages that railroad barons and industrialists built during the 1890s weren't modest summer homes. They were 10-bedroom mansions with servants' quarters and private stables, designed for families who would arrive by steamship and stay for 2 months, because the journey was too arduous to make casually. But here's a detail that got buried under all the grandeur. During construction of the Grand Hotel, workers reportedly unearthed hundreds of human skeletons. There were so many that moving them all was deemed impractical. Whether the remains belonged to indigenous peoples, early European soldiers, or victims of some forgotten frontier conflict, nobody could say for certain. The solution, according to local legend, was to build right over them. The Grand Hotel sits on top of its dead. Today, that detail feeds one of the island's most persistent ghost stories. Whether it's literally true or one of those construction-era legends that attaches itself to impressive buildings, it gives the hotel an unsettling foundation, figuratively and perhaps literally. The same year the Grand Hotel opened, the Murdoch family arrived on Mackinac Island and opened the first candy shop. The timing was no coincidence. The Murdochs saw what the railroad saw, an island filling with vacationers who had money to spend and time to spend it. Rome Murdoch was reportedly the first person on the island to make fudge on marble slabs. And what he created was something better than candy. It was theater. Customers gathered to watch the fudge being balanced, turned, and shaped on the slabs. It became competitive entertainment. Other candy shops opened. Rivals tried to outdo each other. The fudge survived the sugar rationing of 2 world wars and the Depression. Rome's son Gould, desperate for business during lean years, aimed kitchen cooling fans toward the street to blow the scent of fudge at passing pedestrians. He supposedly poured vanilla flavoring into a bubbling cauldron of candy. It added no flavor to the fudge itself, but created an aroma so sweet that pedestrians were physically pulled toward the shop. After World War II, when the interstate highway system made northern Michigan accessible to the expanding middle class, fudge exploded. By the 1960s, so many tourists came specifically for the candy that locals coined a term for them, fudgies. Today, there are 13 fudge shops on Mackinac Island. They produce 10,000 pounds of fudge daily during peak season. The island imports 10 tons of sugar every week. That combination, the hotel, the fudge, the Victorian architecture, the clean northern air, the horse carriages, and a growing American desire to visit a place that felt simpler than the world outside, created the tourist economy that still runs the island today. Now hold that thought, because something happened in 1895 that changed the island's trajectory in a way few people talk about. Remember that the soldiers at Fort Mackinac were doing double duty as National Park Rangers. Remember that Congress had never appropriated a cent for the park's maintenance. Those two facts are about to collide. By the early 1890s, the Army had little justification to keep soldiers at Fort Mackinac. The frontier had moved west. The strategic importance of the straits had diminished. Budget cuts were closing forts across the country. The garrison had been reduced steadily over the years. What had once been a substantial force had dwindled to a skeleton crew. In March 1895, the last 11 soldiers, under the command of a lieutenant, marched out of Fort Mackinac for the final time. The fort was decommissioned. And because the Army had been running Mackinac National Park, and because there was no National Park Service yet to take over, and because Congress had no interest in spending money on a park it had never funded, the federal government simply gave the whole thing away. The national park, the fort, the roads, the trails, all of it, transferred to the state of Michigan at the request of Governor John T. Rich. Mackinac National Park ceased to exist. It became Michigan's first state park, and America's second national park, designated just 3 years after Yellowstone, quietly lost its federal status. It is, as far as anyone can determine, the only U.S. national park to have been decommissioned. Today, most people who visit Mackinac Island have no idea it was ever a national park at all. Ask someone to name the second national park, and they'll probably say Yosemite, which was designated in 1890, 15 years after Mackinac had already held the title. So by the end of the 19th century, the ledger already looked remarkable. The fur trade, gone. The military garrison, gone. The national park status, gone. The fishing industry, fading. What remained was tourism, only tourism. The island had no factory, no mine, no railroad hub, no year-round industry. It had scenery, a ban on automobiles, and a very long porch. That automobile ban deserves a closer look. because it's become the island's most famous feature, and the story behind it is more practical than romantic. In 1898, a handful of horseless carriages appeared on the island. The carriage operators, the men who made their living from horse-drawn transport, petitioned the village council to ban the machines. On July 6, 1898, the council obliged. The formal resolution read, that the running of horseless carriages be prohibited within the limits of the village of Mackinac. 2 years later, a summer visitor named Earl C. Anthony ignored the ban and brought a steam-powered locomobile to the island, where it reportedly startled and injured horses and wrecked several carriages. The State Park Commission responded by outlawing automobiles in the park in 1901. What began as a business decision by carriage operators protecting their livelihood became, over the next century, the island's defining characteristic. Every other municipality in America eventually embraced the automobile. Mackinac never did. The ban was tested repeatedly. In 1935, a man named E.M. Tellefson regularly drove a 1928 Buick to the top of the island, where he maintained a commercial radio tower. It took a Michigan court ruling to stop him. His Buick was placed in storage on the island and sat there for 40 years before being moved to the mainland, restored, and sold. In 1960, the ban was formally written into law. M185, the 8-mile road that circles the island, became the only state highway in the country where motor vehicles are banned. The road is 12 feet wide, roughly one modern traffic lane. It was never designed for cars because it was paved after the island had already decided to never allow them. The ban wasn't nostalgia, it was economics. But the effect was nostalgia so complete that visitors began to feel they were traveling backward in time simply by stepping off the ferry. When President Gerald Ford visited the island in 1975, the only sitting president to do so, he and Betty traveled by horse-drawn carriage. The Secret Service brought a single vehicle tucked away for emergencies. When Vice President Mike Pence visited in 2019, he arrived in an 8-vehicle motorcade of black SUVs shipped to the island the night before. It was the first ever motorcade on Mackinac Island, and social media erupted with cries of sacrilege. The gap between those two visits, Ford in a carriage, Pence in a convoy, tells you something about the distance between the island's mythology and the modern world pressing against it. And here is where the paradox deepens. The very decision that made Mackinac Island unique also locked it into an identity that required it to never change. The island couldn't modernize its transportation without destroying its brand. It couldn't expand its economy without disrupting its charm. It had to remain frozen, beautiful, accessible, and permanently stuck in 1898, or risk becoming just another island. The Grand Hotel survived the Depression. Barely. Tourism collapsed, revenue dried up. The hotel fell into receivership in the early 1930s. William Stewart Woodfill, who had managed the property and loved it the way some people love houses that are too big for them, purchased it as sole owner in 1933 for what was reportedly a fraction of its original cost. He poured his life into the place. He gradually turned management over to a man named Dan Musser, who joined the hotel staff in 1951. The Musser family eventually purchased the hotel from Woodfill in 1979, though the families were related, Woodfill being Musser's great-uncle. 3 generations of Mussers would run the Grand Hotel for the next 4 decades, maintaining its traditions with a devotion that bordered on stubbornness. The dress code, the 5-course dinners, the afternoon tea, the orchestra, the front porch that guests were required to appreciate. In 1957, the Mackinac Bridge opened, connecting Michigan's upper and lower peninsulas for the first time by road. The bridge cost $100 million, stretched 5 miles across the straits, and was one of the longest suspension bridges in the world. 5 men died during construction. Governor G. Menon Williams was the first to drive across on November 1st, 1957, and when he did, the world that had sustained the Straits region for decades ended with him. Before the bridge, visitors had been a captive audience. They waited for car ferries. Sometimes 9,000 cars backed up in a single day during peak season. And while they waited, they spent money. They ate at restaurants in Mackinac City and St. Ignace. They slept in motels. They wandered the shops. The car ferry workers alone numbered in the hundreds. The journey to Mackinac Island was an event in itself, and the towns on either shore lived off the friction that the crossing created. After the bridge, that friction disappeared. Travelers could drive straight through without stopping. The gateway towns began to hollow out. Unprofitable businesses closed. Families relocated. The ferry crews were gone. The construction workers were gone. What had been a regional economy built on maritime transport became increasingly a tourism pipeline feeding one destination, the island. St. Ignace, which once had a blue-collar economy anchored by ferry jobs and Great Lakes freighter work, became almost entirely dependent on tourism. The bridge was a marvel of engineering. It was also the thing that turned the entire Straits economy into a one-industry corridor. Then came the movie. In 1979, a film crew received special permission to bring motor vehicles onto car-free Mackinac Island to shoot a time-travel romance called Somewhere in Time. The movie, starring Christopher Reeve and Jane Seymour, used the Grand Hotel as its central location. It flopped at the box office. One New York Times reviewer said it did for time travel what the Hindenburg did for dirigibles. But like many cult classics, its failure was temporary. Over the years, Somewhere in Time developed a devoted following. Fans made pilgrimages to the Grand Hotel. The hotel hosted an annual Somewhere in Time weekend with costume promenades, film screenings, and appearances by Seymour herself. The movie didn't change the island exactly, but it completed the transformation that had been underway for a century. Mackinac Island was no longer a place. It was an idea, a fantasy of a past that never quite existed, a destination that sold the feeling of traveling backward through time to an America that was simpler, grander, and more beautiful than the one outside the ferry dock. The reality for the people who actually lived there was more complicated. By the late 20th century, Mackinac Island's year-round population had settled at roughly 500 people. The entire public school district had about 70 students. Everyone knew everyone. In the summer, the island swelled to 15,000 or more, seasonal workers filling hotels, restaurants, and shops, plus the daily crush of tourists arriving by ferry. Many of those seasonal workers were no longer American. The island increasingly relied on J-1 visa students from abroad, young people from Ireland, Eastern Europe, the Caribbean, willing to work the register at a gift shop for $15 an hour in a place where the cost of living was significantly higher than mainland Michigan. For workers from abroad, those wages might have real purchasing power back home. For American workers, the math rarely worked out. When the season ended in October, the shops closed. The hotels shuttered. The Grand Hotel dropped from 715 employees to about 60. The ferry service slowed and eventually stopped when the lake froze. The 500 who remained relied on snowmobiles and small aircraft to reach the mainland. There was one grocery store. Supplies had to be stockpiled before winter storms arrived. Children rode snowmobiles to school, if the weather cooperated. Bad weather could delay travel to the mainland for days. The nearest hospital was across the water. The island's Community Foundation conducted a survey and found the average household size was 2. The average age was 35, and the average income was about $39,000 a year, a modest wage on an island where the median home was worth over $700,000. The island's entire economy depended on tourism. The most common jobs were in accommodation and food service. The average household income was around $39,000. The median property value climbed past $700,000. That gap between what people earned on the island and what the island's real estate was worth told you everything about who the place was really for. The Victorian cottages on the bluffs, the ones tourists photographed from below, were owned by families whose roots went back generations and whose wealth came from somewhere else. The workers who kept the island running in summer often lived in employer-provided housing because they couldn't afford to live there otherwise. And then in 2019, the last major institution fell. Dan Musser III, the third-generation owner and president of the Grand Hotel, announced that the family had entered into a definitive agreement to sell the property to KSL Capital Partners, a private equity firm based in Denver. The 397-room hotel, celebrating its 133rd season, would pass from family ownership to corporate investors. It has truly been an honor and a privilege for my family to serve as steward of this incredible Michigan landmark for nearly 9 decades, Musser said. This is a role we have not taken lightly. KSL's portfolio included luxury resorts in Florida, California, and Rhode Island. Pivot Hotels and Resorts, a division of Davidson Hotels, would manage the property going forward. Musser would stay on as chairman. The terms of the sale were never disclosed. The hotel employed about 715 workers at peak season and dropped to about 60 in winter. The new owners committed to maintaining traditions. The dress code stayed, the porch stayed, the 5-course meals stayed. But the Grand Hotel was no longer run by a family that had agonized over it, prayed about it, and considered it part of their life story. It was an asset in a portfolio of assets, managed by a management company hired by an investment firm. The difference may not have been visible from the porch. It rarely is at first. The island's vulnerability, the consequence of depending entirely on tourism, became vivid in the years that followed. The ferries that carried visitors to the island, which had for decades been operated by competing family-owned companies, began consolidating. Shepler's Ferry, a 3-generation family business, sold to the Hoffman family of companies, a Florida-based firm, in 2022. In 2024, Hoffman acquired the other major ferry line, the Mackinac Island Ferry Company, and rebranded it as Arnold Transit, reviving the name of a ferry company that had served the island for 140 years. Suddenly, a single out-of-state company owned both ferry operations. It controlled roughly 90 to 95% of passenger ferry service and 80 to 85% of parking in and around the gateway towns. The city of Mackinac Island called it a monopoly. Mayor Margaret Dowd warned that the company's ownership of ferries, docks, parking lots, and buildings made it the single largest real estate owner on the island. When Hoffman proposed raising ticket prices, the city tried to freeze rates. Hoffman sued. The city countersued. A federal judge dismissed the island's antitrust claims. The Michigan Senate passed a bill to give the island authority to regulate ferry prices. And in early 2026, the ferry company sent letters suggesting it might discontinue operations entirely by 2027 if a new agreement wasn't reached. Consider what that means for an island that has no bridge, no airport with commercial service, and no cars. If the ferries stop, everything stops. 1 million visitors a year, the entire economy, the jobs, the tax base, the supply chain, all of it runs through boats that are now owned by a single company in Naples, Florida, that is locked in litigation with the island's government. The Michigan Attorney General urged both sides to enter mediation. The island's Tourism Bureau spent an extra $155,000 on advertising to overcome the bad publicity. New fees threatened to push the cost of a simple family day trip to the island past $200. The place that once controlled the most important strait in the Great Lakes, the island that empires fought over because whoever held it held the waterways, is now, in a sense, controlled by whoever controls the boats. John Jacob Astor used Mackinac Island because it sat at the center of every trade route. 2 centuries later, that same geographic isolation became a vulnerability. You cannot drive to Mackinac Island. You cannot take a bus. You cannot walk. You arrive by ferry, or you do not arrive, and the ferries belong to someone else. That 660-foot porch. Go back to it one more time. In 1887, when it was built in 93 days, on top of bones that nobody could identify, it was the front row of the Gilded Age. Wealthy Midwesterners sat in its rocking chairs and looked out at a strait that had been fought over by empires. By the 1980s, the porch was the backdrop for a time travel movie that bombed and then became a cult classic. By 2019, it was a feature of a private equity portfolio. The wood is original in places. The view hasn't changed. The rocking chairs still face the water. There are about 500 people on Mackinac Island right now in the off-season. Some were born there. Some married into families who were born there. Some came for a summer job decades ago and never left. They know the island when the tourists are gone, when the fudge shops are dark and the ferry docks are empty, and the snow covers Main Street, and the only sounds are wind and the occasional snowmobile engine cutting through the silence. They know the grocery store runs low on fresh produce by February. They know the ice bridge to the mainland doesn't always form. They know every year the question gets a little louder. How long can 500 people sustain a place that only makes money for 5 months? Mackinac Island lost the fur trade that built it. It lost the national park designation that distinguished it. It lost the military fort that protected it. It lost the fishing industry that briefly replaced the fur trade. It lost the family that ran its greatest building for 86 years. It is in the process of losing control over the boats that bring its economy to its shore. And through all of it, through every collapse, every departure, every quiet transfer of power, the porch kept gleaming, the horses kept pulling, the fudge kept pouring, and the tourists kept coming. And nobody thought to ask whether a place could look perfectly alive and still be losing everything underneath. 13 fudge shops, 10,000 pounds of fudge handcrafted daily in peak season, 10 tons of sugar imported every week, 1 million visitors a year who arrive, buy, and leave, and 500 people who stay. The lilacs bloom in June. If you're on the ferry approaching the island from the south, you can see the Grand Hotel up on the bluff, its white facade catching the light, the porch stretching so far it seems to bend with the curve of the earth. For a moment, just for a moment, everything looks exactly the way it's supposed to. The rocking chairs are out, the flag is up, the horses are waiting at the dock. The last 11 soldiers who marched out of Fort Mackinac in March of 1895 probably looked back at least once. What they saw was the same thing you see now: the limestone walls, the bluff, the water. Nothing about the view has changed.